In a few minutes, we will say the Amidah, the standing prayer for Musaf. And the rabbis had in mind when we say any Amidah, any prayer before God, that our eyes are cast downwards, but our hearts are lifted up to heaven. And I want to invite, first of all, that as you say the prayer at Musaf and other times, that you give that a try. What does it mean for me to look downward? What does it mean for me to lift up my heart to heaven? I mention this because it is related to this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion, as we have been talking a lot about, commands the Jewish people to embark upon an impossible task: to create a dwelling place in the physical world for a God who is not physical, to create a home in the world which is limited for a God who is without limits. To use things like gold and silver and dolphin skins and other things that we mentioned before to try to contain the holy. And so the rabbis from the very beginning said that we are not just creating things, but that in each of the directions, in each of the specifications, and there were a lot of them, and there will be a lot of them over the next few weeks, in each one of those things, we can learn something about the question of how do we bring God's presence from worlds beyond into this world. And my teacher, the Kliyakar, Rabbi Ephraim of Lunchitz, has a beautiful teaching about one of these details. For the mathematicians in the audience, he noticed that all of the dimensions of the arc are fractions. 2.5, 3.5, but always with fractions. And all of the dimensions for the altar are whole numbers. And all of the dimensions for the table, the shulchan upon which we find the lechem hapanim, the showbread, are a combination of whole numbers and fractions. And he says from this we can learn some very important things. From the altar and the whole numbers, we learn that the altar is there to help us atone to become whole. That we can't be whole without atonement, without forgiveness. And I'm going to leave that one aside and focus on the other two. The ark is fractions because when it comes to the world of Torah, when it comes to the world of the Spirit, when it comes to the world of ideas, we should view ourselves as incomplete. We lack knowledge. Our eyes should be down because we should admit We don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. The rabbis say in another place, Ezehu chacham halomed mikol adam. Who is one who is wise? Someone who learns from every human being. How many of us walk through the world? Really? And look at every person and say, there's something I can learn from that person. Not very many. We judge. We cancel. We get angry and write people off instead of being curious and asking. The rabbis tell a story from Masechet Ta'anit in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Palestinian Talmud, about a rabbi who was visited. It was a time of drought and the Jewish people needed rain. And the rabbi is visited in a dream and he's told, if the Jewish people's prayers are to be answered, you need to hear the prayers of this guy. The name in Greek doesn't matter. You should know that the name in Greek translated to, this was the rabbi's way of telling stories. What did his name translate to? Mr. Evil. Those of you who like the Austin Power movies, feel free to fill in Dr. Evil. If the prayers of the Jewish people are to be heard, we have to hear, you have to go and visit Dr. Evil, Mr. Evil. And so he goes and finds this guy. What does he do? He works at a brothel. Says, what do you do for a living? Well, you know, there are prostitutes and there's things that need to be cleaned up and there's dancing. And I sort of, make it all right. The rabbi, who's been sent on this mission and is probably wondering how he finds himself here, he says, well, have you ever done any mitzvah? And he says, well, one time there was a woman who was standing by a post and she was very sad and it looked like she was about to essentially sell herself into prostitution because her husband was in jail and he needed to make bail. And I went over to her and I heard her story and I said, why don't you take these clothes and sell them and get your husband out of jail, but don't do this. You don't want to do this. And the rabbi said, now I understand. Because if you're a rabbi in the Beit Midrash, you can't do that mitzvah. There are mitzvot, there are acts of goodness and kindness that can only be done by people who we write off. There are insights of wisdom that exist only in the places where you are certain there is no wisdom to be found. And so we cast our eyes downward to remind ourselves we don't have all the answers. And when it comes to the table, the shulchan, where there's bread, there's both fractions and whole numbers. And he says, regarding the fractions, the reason that it's there is that this shulchan is about bread, it's about the material stuff of the world, and it's good for us to not fulfill all of our appetites. Okay, this is the more ascetic part of him. He said, leave a little bit on the table. There's probably some good advice there. But he said, but why are there whole numbers? Because ultimately, when it comes to matters of this world, what we should say is, I have so much. I have more than I need. I am whole. We should turn our eyes upward and thank God for all that we have. And when we do that, we should give to everyone who is in need, rather than feeling a sense of scarcity and fear that we don't have enough. We should open our hands. So I invite you to pray with our eyes turned downward and our hearts lifted upward. I invite us to pray for a sense of humility when it comes to all of the things that we can learn from others, and to pray with a full heart at how lucky we are to live in this time, to be in this building, to have what we have, and to let that move us to have a generous heart to take care of so many others who are in need. Shabbat shalom. Please